Chapter 16 of The Pioneers, or The Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 16. Quote, Watch, aside, some treason masters, yet stand close. Unquote. From Much Ado About Nothing. It was fortunate for more than one of the bacchanalians who left the Bold Dragoon late in the evening that the severe cold of the season was becoming rapidly less dangerous as they treaded the different mazes through the snow banks that led to their respective dwellings. Then driving clouds began toward morning to flit across the heavens, and the moon set behind a volume of vapor that was impelled furiously toward the north, carrying with it the softer atmosphere from the distant ocean. The rising sun was obscured by denser and increasing columns of clouds, while the southerly wind that rushed up the valley brought the never failing symptoms of a thaw. It was quite late in the morning before Elizabeth, observing the faint glow which appeared on the eastern mountain long after the light of the sun had struck the opposite hills, ventured from the house with a view to gratify her curiosity with a glance by daylight at the surrounding objects before the tardy revellers of the Christmas Eve should make their appearance at the breakfast table. While she was drawing the folds of her pelisse more closely around her form, to guard against a cold that was yet great though rapidly yielding, in the small enclosure that opened in the rear of the house on a little thicket of low pines that were springing up where trees of a mightier growth had lately stood, she was surprised at the voice of Mr. Jones. "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas to you, Cousin Bess!" he shouted. "Aha! An early riser, I see. But I knew I should steal a march on you. I never was in a house yet where I didn't get the first Christmas greeting on every soul in it, man, woman, and child, great and small, black, white, and yellow. But stop a minute till I can just slip on my coat. You are about to look at the improvements, I see, which no one can explain so well as I, who planned them all. It will be an hour before Duke and Major can sleep off Mrs. Hollister's confounded distillations, and so I'll come down and go with you." Elizabeth turned and observed her cousin in his nightcap, with his head out of his bedroom window, where his zeal for preeminence in defiance of the weather had impelled him to thrust it. She laughed, and, promising to wait for his company, re-entered the house, making her appearance again, holding in her hand a packet that was secured by several large and important seals, just in time to meet the gentleman. "Come, Bessie, come," he cried, drawing one of her arms through his own. "The snow begins to give, but it will bear us yet. Don't you snuff old Pennsylvania in the very air? This is a vile climate, girl. Now, at sunset last evening it was cold enough to freeze a man's zeal, and that, I tell you, takes a thermometer near zero for me. Then about 9 or 10 it began to moderate. At 12 it was quite mild, and here all the rest of the night I have been so hot as not to bear a blanket on the bed. Hola, Aggie! Merry Christmas! Aggie, I say, do you hear me? You black dog, there's $1 for you, and if the gentleman met up before I come back, do you come out and let me know. I wouldn't have Duke get the start on me for the worth of your head." The black caught the money from the snow, and, promising a due degree of watchfulness, he gave the dollar a whirl of 20 feet in the air, and, catching it as it fell in the palm of his hand, he withdrew to the kitchen to exhibit his present with a heart as light as his face was happy in its expression. "Oh, rest easy, my dear coz," said the young lady. "I took a look in at my father, who is likely to sleep an hour, and by using due vigilance you will secure all the honors of the season." "Why, Duke is your father, Elizabeth, but Duke is a man who likes to be foremost, even in trifles. Now, As for myself, I care for no such things, except in the way of competition; for a thing which is of no moment in itself may be made of importance in way of competition. So it is with your father; he loves to be first, but I only struggle with him as a competitor."
"It's all very clear, sir," said Elizabeth. "You would not care a fig for distinction if there were no one in the world but yourself; but as there happens to be a great many others, why, you must struggle with them all in the way of competition."
"Exactly so. I see you are a clever girl, Bess, and one who does credit to her masters. It was my plan to send you to that school; for when your father first mentioned the thing, I wrote a private letter for advice to a judicious friend in the city, who recommended me the very school you went to. 'Duke was a little obstinate at first, as usual; but when he heard the truth, he was obliged to send you."
"Well, a truce to 'Duke's foibles, sir. He is my father, and if you knew what he has been doing for you while you were in Albany, you would deal more tenderly with his character."
"For me!"
cried Richard, pausing a moment in his walk to reflect.
"Oh, he got the plans for the new Dutch meeting house for me, I suppose; but I care very little about it, for a man of a certain kind of talent is seldom aided by any foreign suggestions. His own brain is the best architect."
"No such thing," said Elizabeth, looking provokingly knowing.
"No? Let me see. Perhaps he had my name put in the bill for the new turnpike, as a director?"
"He might possibly, but it is no such an appointment that I allude."
"Such an appointment!" repeated Mr. Jones, who began to fidget with curiosity. "Then it is an appointment. If it is in the militia, I won't take it."
"No, no, it's not the militia," cried Elizabeth, showing the packet in her hand, and then drawing it back with a coquettish air. "It is an office of both honor and emolument."
"Honor and emolument!"
echoed Richard, in painful suspense.
"Show me the paper, girl. Say, is it an office where there is anything to do?"
"You have hit it, Cousin Dickon. It is the executive office of the county; at least so said my father when he gave me this packet to offer you as a Christmas box. Surely, if anything will please Dickon, he said, it will be to fill the executive chair of the county."
"Executive chair! What nonsense!" cried the impatient gentleman, snatching the packet from her hand. "There is no such office in the county. What it is, I declare, a commission, appointing Richard Jones, Esquire, sheriff of the county. Well, this is kind in Duke. Positively, I must say, Duke has a warm heart, and never forgets his friends. Sheriff! High sheriff of It sounds well, Bess; it shall execute better. Duke is a judicious man, after all, and knows human nature thoroughly. I'm much obliged to him," continued Richard, using the skirt of his coat unconsciously to wipe his eyes, "though I would do as much for him any day; and he shall see, if I have an opportunity to perform any of the duties of my office on him. It shall be done, Cousin Bess; it shall be done, I say. How this cursed south wind makes one's eyes water!"
"Now, Richard," said the laughing maiden, "now I think you will find something to do. I have often heard you complain of old that there was nothing to do in this new country, while to my eyes it seemed as if everything remained to be done."
"Do!"
echoed Richard, who blew his nose, raised his little form to its greatest elevation, and looked serious.
"Everything depends on system, girl. I shall sit down this afternoon and systematize the county. I must have deputies, you know. I will divide the county into districts, over which I will place my deputies, and I will have one for the village, which I will call my home department. Let me see. Oh, Benjamin, yes, will make a good deputy. He has been naturalized, and would answer admirably if he could only ride on horseback."
"Yes, Mr. Sheriff," said his companion, "and as he understands ropes so well, he would be very expert should occasion happen for his services in another way."
"No," interrupted the other, "I flatter myself that no man could hang a man better than that is oh, yes, Benjamin would do extremely well in such an unfortunate dilemma, if he could be persuaded to attempt it. But should I despair of the thing, I could never induce him to hang, or teach him to ride on horseback. I must seek another deputy."
"Well, sir, as you have abundant leisure for all these important affairs, I beg that you will forget that you are high sheriff, and devote some little of your time to gallantry. Where are the beauties and improvements which you were to show me?"
"Where? What? Everywhere. Here, I have laid out some new streets, and when they are open, and the trees felled, and they are all built up, will they not make a fine town? Well, 'Duke is a liberal-hearted fellow, with all his stubbornness. Yes, yes, I must have at least 4 deputies, besides a jailer."
"I see no streets in the direction of our walk," said Elizabeth, "unless you call the short avenues through these pine bushes by that name. Surely you do not contemplate building houses very soon in that forest before us, and in those swamps?"
"We must run our streets by the compass, coz, and disregard trees, hills, ponds, slumps, or, in fact, anything but posterity. Such is the will of your father, and your father, you know."
"Had made you sheriff, Mr. Jones," interrupted the lady, with a tone that said very plainly to the gentleman that he was touching a forbidden subject.
"I know it, I know it," cried Richard, "and if it were in my power, I'd make 'Duke a king. He's a noble-hearted fellow, and would make an excellent king; that is, if he had a good prime minister. But who have we here? Voices in the bushes, a combination about mischief. I'll wager my commission. Let us draw near and examine a little into the matter."
During this dialogue, as the parties had kept in motion, Richard and his cousin advanced some distance from the house into the open space in the rear of the village, where, as may be gathered from the conversation, streets were planned and future dwellings contemplated, but where, in truth, the only mark of improvement that was to be seen was a neglected clearing along the skirt of a dark forest of mighty pines, over which the bushes or sprouts of the same tree had sprung up to a height that interspersed the fields of snow with little thickets of evergreen. The rushing of the wind, as it whistled through the tops of these mimic trees, prevented the footsteps of the pair from being heard while the branches concealed their persons. Thus aided, the listeners drew nigh to a spot where the young hunter, Leatherstocking, and the Indian chief were collected in an earnest consultation. The former was urgent in his manner, and seemed to think the subject of deep importance, while Natty appeared to listen with more than his usual attention to what the other was saying. Mohican stood a little on one side, with his head sunken on his chest, his hair falling forward so as to conceal most of his features, and his whole attitude expressive of deep dejection, if not shame.
"Let us withdraw,"
whispered Elizabeth.
"we are intruders, and can have no right to listen to the secrets of these men."
"No right?"
returned Richard, a little impatiently, in the same tone, and drawing her arm so forcibly through his own as to prevent her retreat.
"You forget, cousin, that it is my duty to preserve the peace of the county, and see the laws executed. These wanderers frequently commit depredations, though I do not think John would do anything secretly. Poor fellow, he was quite boozy last night, and hardly seems to be over it yet. Let us draw nigher and hear what they say."
Notwithstanding the lady's reluctance, Richard, stimulated doubtless by his sense of duty, prevailed, and they were soon near as distinctly to hear sounds. "The bird must be had," said Natty, "by fair means or foul. Hi ho! I've known the time, lad, when the wild turkeys wasn't over scarce in the country, though you must go to the Virginia gaps if you want them now. To be sure, there's a different taste to a partridge and a well fatted turkey, though to my eating
Beaver's tail and bear's ham make the best food; but then every one has his own appetite. I gave the last farthing, all to that shilling, to the French trader this very morning, as I came through town for powder; so, as you have nothing, we can have but one shot for it. I know that Billy Kirby is out, and means to have a pull of the trigger at that very turkey. John has a true eye for a single fire, and somehow my hand shakes so when I have to do anything extraordinary that I often lose my aim. Now, when I killed the she bear this fall with her cubs, though they were so mighty ravenous, I knocked them over one at a shot, and loaded while I dodged the trees in the bargain. But this is a very different thing, Mr. Oliver." "This!" cried the young man, with an accent that sounded as if he took a bitter pleasure in his poverty, while he held a shilling up before his eyes. "This is all the treasure that I possess. This is my rifle, now. Indeed, I have become a man of the woods, and must place my sole dependence on the chase. Come, Natty, let us stake the last penny for the bird. With your aim, I cannot fail to be successful." "I would rather it be John, lad. My heart jumps into my mouth because you sent your mind so much out, and I'm certain that I shall miss the bird. These Indians can shoot one time as well as another; nothing ever troubles them. I say, John, here's a shilling; take my rifle, and get a shot at the big turkey they put up on the stump. Mr. Oliver is over anxious for the creature, and I'm sure to do nothing when I have over anxiety about it." The Indian turned his head gloomily, and after looking keenly for a moment in profound silence at his companions, he replied: "When John was young, eyesight was not straighter than his bullet. The Mingo squaws cried out at the sound of his rifle. The Mingo warriors were made squaws. When did he ever shoot twice? The eagle went above the clouds when he passed the wigwam of Chingachgook. His feathers were plenty with the woman. But see," he said, raising his voice from the low, mournful tones in which he had spoken to a pitch of keen excitement, and stretching forth both hands, "they shake like a deer at the wolf's howl. Is John old? One was a Mohican, a squaw with 70 winters. No, the white man brings old age with him. Rum is his tomahawk."
"Why, then, do you use it, old man?" exclaimed the young hunter. "Why will one so noble by nature aid the devices of the devil by making himself a beast?"
"Beast! Is John a beast?" replied the Indian slowly. "Yes, you say no lie, child of the fire eater. John is a beast. The smokes were once few in these hills. The deer would lick the hand of a white man, and the birds rest on his head. They were strangers to him. My fathers came from the shores of the Salt Lake. They fled before rum. They came to their grandfather, and they lived in peace; or when they did raise the hatchet, it was to strike the brain of a Mingo. They gathered around council fire, and what they said was done. Then John was a man. But warriors and traders with light eyes followed them. One brought the long knife, and one brought rum. They were more than the pines of the mountains, and they broke up the councils and took the lands. The evil spirit was in their jugs, and they let him loose. Yes, you say no lie, young eagle. John is a Christian beast."
"Forgive me, old warrior," cried the youth, grasping his hand. "I should be the last to approach you. The curses of heaven light on the cupidity that has destroyed such a race. Remember, John, that I am of your family, and it is now my greatest pride."
The muscles of Mohican relaxed a little, and he said more mildly: "You are a Delaware, my son. Your words are not heard. John cannot shoot."
"I thought that lad had Indian blood in him," whispered Richard, "by the awkward way he handled my horses last night. You see, coz, they never use harness. But the poor fellow shall have 2 shots at the turkey if he wants it, for I'll give him another shilling myself, though perhaps I had better offer to shoot for him. They have got up their Christmas sports, I find, in the bushes yonder, where you hear the laughter, though it's a queer taste this chap has for turkey. not but what it good eating too."
"Hold, Cousin Richard," exclaimed Elizabeth, clinging to his arm; "would it be delicate to offer a shilling to that gentleman?"
"Gentleman again! Do you think a half breed like him will refuse money? No, no, girl, he will take the shilling, ay, and even rum too, notwithstanding he moralizes so much about it. But I'll give the lad a chance for his turkey, for that Billy Kirby is one of the best marksmen in the country; that is, if we except the gentleman."
"Then," said Elizabeth, who found her strength unequal to her will, "then, sir, I will speak." She advanced with an air of determination in front of her cousin, and entered the little circle of bushes that surrounded the trio of hunters. Her appearance startled the youth, who at first made an unequivocal motion toward retiring, but recollecting himself, bowed by lifting his cap, and resumed his attitude of leaning on his rifle. Neither Natty nor Mohican betrayed any emotion, though the appearance of Elizabeth was so entirely unexpected. "I find," she said, "that the old Christmas sport of shooting the turkey is yet in use among you. I feel inclined to try my chance for a bird. Which of you will take this money, and, after paying my fee, give me the aid of his rifle?" "Is this sport for a lady?" exclaimed the young hunter, with an emphasis that could not well be mistaken, and with a rapidity that showed he spoke without consulting anything but feeling. "Why not, sir? If it be inhumane, the sin is not confined to one sex only. But I have my humor as well as others. I ask not your assistance, but," turning to Natty, and dropping $1 in his hand, "this old veteran of the forest will not be so ungallant as to refuse one fire for a lady." Leatherstocking dropped the money into his pouch, and, throwing up the end of his rifle, he freshened his priming, and first, laughing in his usual manner, he threw the piece over his shoulder, and said: "If Bill Kirby don't get the bird before me, and the Frenchman's powder don't hang fire damp this morning, you'll see as fine a turkey dead in a few minutes as ever was eaten in the Judge's shanty. I have knowed the Dutchwoman on the Mohawk and Schoharie count greatly on coming to the merry makings; and so, lad, you shouldn't be short with the lady. Come, let us go forward, for if we wait the finest bird will be gone."
"But I have a right before you, Natty, and shall try my own luck first. You will excuse me, Miss Temple. I have much reason to wish that bird, and may seem ungallant, but I must claim my privileges." "Claim everything that is justly your own, sir," returned the lady. "We are both adventurers, and this is my knight. I trust my fortune to his hand and eye. Lead on, Sir Leatherstocking, and we will follow." Natty, who seemed pleased with the frank address of the young and beauteous Elizabeth, who had so singularly interested him with such a commission, returned the bright smile with which she had addressed him, by his own particular mark of mirth, and moved across the snow toward the spot whence the sounds of boisterous mirth proceeded, with the long strides of a hunter. His companions followed in silence, the youth casting frequent and uneasy glances toward Elizabeth, who was detained by a motion from Richard.
"I should think, Miss Temple,"
he said, so soon as the others were out of hearing,
"that if you really wished a turkey, we would not have taken a stranger for the office, and such one as Leatherstocking. But I can hardly believe that you are serious, for I have 50 at this moment shut up in the coops, in every stage of fat, so that you might choose any quality you pleased. There are 6 that I am trying an experiment on by giving them brickbats with—"
"Enough, Cousin Dickon," interrupted the lady. "I do wish the bird, and it is because I wish that I commissioned Mr. Leatherstocking."
"Did you ever hear of the great shot that I made of the wolf, Cousin Elizabeth, who was carrying off your father's sheep?"
said Richard, drawing himself with an air of displeasure.
"He had the sheep on his hack, and had the head of the wolf between on the other side. I should have killed him dead as it was."
"You killed the sheep. I know it all, dear coz. What would have been disastrous for the high sheriff of
to mingle with such sports as these."
"Surely you did not think that I intended actually to fire with my own hands," said Mr. Jones; "but let us follow and see the shooting. There is no fear of anything unpleasant occurring to a female in this new country, especially to your father's daughter, and in my presence."
"My father's daughter fears nothing, sir, more especially when escorted by the highest executive officer in the county."
She took his arm, and he led her through the mazes of the bushes to the spot where most of the young men of the village were collected for the sport of shooting a Christmas match, and whither Natty and his companions had already preceded them. Chapter 16. This reading by Gary W. Sherwin, of Yukon, Pennsylvania, in August of 2009. Chapter 17 of The Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 17. Quote, "I guess, by all this quaint array, the burghers hold their sports to day." Unquote, by Scott. The ancient amusement of shooting the Christmas turkey is one of the few sports that the settlers of a new country seldom or never neglect to observe. It was connected with the daily practices of a people who often laid aside the axe or the scythe to seize the rifle, as the deer glided through the forest they were felling, or the bear entered their rough meadows to scent the air of a clearing, and to scan with a look of sagacity the progress of the invader. On the present occasion, the usual amusement of the day had been a little hastened, in order to allow a fair opportunity to Mr. Grant, whose exhibition was not less a treat to the young sportsmen than the one which engaged their present attention. The owner of the birds was a free black, who had prepared for the occasion a collection of game that was admirably qualified to inflame the appetite of an epicure, and was well adapted to the means and skill of the different competitors, who were of all ages. He had offered the younger and more humble marksmen divers birds of an inferior quality, and some shooting had already taken place, much to the pecuniary advantage of the sable owner of the game. The order of the sports was extremely simple and well understood. The bird was fastened by a string to the stump of a large pine, the side of which, toward the point where the marksmen were placed, had been flattened with an axe, in order that it might serve the purpose of a target, by which the merit of each individual might be ascertained. The distance between the stump and the shooting stand was 100 measured yards, a foot more or a foot less being thought an invasion of the right of one of the parties. The negro affixed his own price to every bird, and the terms of the chance; but when these were once established, he was obliged, by the strict principles of public justice that prevailed in the country, to admit any adventurer who might offer. The throng consisted of some 20 or 30 young men, most of whom had rifles, and a collection of boys in the village. The little urchins, clad in coarse but warm garments, stood gathered around the more distinguished marksmen, with their hands stuck under their waistbands, listening eagerly to the boastful stories of skill that had been exhibited on former occasions, and were already emulating in their hearts these wonderful deeds of gunnery. The chief speaker was the man who had been mentioned by Natty as Billy Kirby. The fellow, whose occupation, when he did labor, was that of clearing lands or chopping jobs, was of great stature, and carried in his very air the index of his character. He was a noisy, boisterous, reckless lad, whose good-natured eye contradicted the bluntness and bullying tenor of his speech. For weeks he would lounge around the taverns of the county in a state of perfect idleness, or doing small jobs for his liquor and his meals, and cavilling with applicants about the prices of his labor, frequently preferring idleness to an abatement of a little of his independence, or a cent in his wages. But, when these embarrassing points were satisfactorily arranged, he would shoulder his axe and rifle, slip his arms through the straps of his pack, and enter the woods with the tread of a Hercules. His first object was to learn his limits, round which he would pace occasionally, freshening, with a blow of his axe, the marks on the boundary trees, and then he would proceed with an air of great deliberation to the centre of his premises, and, throwing aside his superfluous garments, measure with a knowing eye one or two of the nearest trees that were towering apparently into the very clouds as he gazed upward. Commonly selecting one of the most noble for the first trial of his power, he would approach it with a listless air, whistling a low tune, and wielding his axe with a certain flourish, not unlike the salutes of a fencing master, he would strike a light blow into the bark, and measure his distance. The pause that followed was ominous of the fall of the forest which had flourished there for centuries. The heavy and brisk blows that he struck were soon succeeded by the thundering report of the tree, as it came, first cracking and threatening with the separation of its own last ligaments, then threshing and tearing with its branches the tops of its surrounding brethren, and finally meeting the ground with a shock but little inferior to an earthquake. From that moment the sounds of the axe were ceaseless, while the failing of the trees was like a distant cannonading, and the daylight broke into the depths of the woods with the suddenness of a winter morning. For days, weeks, nay, months, Bill Kirby would toil with an ardor that evinced his native spirit, and with an effect that seemed magical, until, his chopping being ended, his stentorian lungs could be heard emitting sounds, as he called to his patient oxen, which rang through the hills like cries of an alarm. He had been often heard on a midsummer evening, a long mile across the vale of Templeton, when the echoes from the mountains would take up his cries until they died away in the feeble sounds from the distant rocks that overhung the lake. His piles, or, to use the language of the country, his logging ended, with a dispatch that could only accompany his dexterity and Herculean strength, the jobber would collect together his implements of labor, light the heaps of lumber, and march away under the blaze of the prostrate forest, like the conqueror of some city, who, having first prevailed over his adversary, applies the torch as the finishing blow to his conquest. For a long time Billy Kirby would then be seen sauntering around the taverns, the rider of scrub races, the bully of cockfights, and not infrequently the hero of such sports as the one in hand. Between him and the Leatherstocking there had long existed a jealous rivalry on the point of skill with the rifle. Notwithstanding the long practice of Natty, it was commonly supposed that the steady nerves and the quick eye of the wood chopper rendered him his equal. The competition had, however, been confined hitherto to boasting, and comparisons made from their success in various hunting excursions; but this was the first time they had ever come in open collision. A good deal of higgling about the price of the choicest bird had taken place between Billy Kirby and its owner before Natty and his companions rejoined the sportsmen. It had, however, been settled at 1 shilling a shot, which was the highest sum ever extracted. [Footnote: Before the Revolution, each province had its own money of account, though neither coined any but copper pieces. In New York the Spanish dollar was divided into 8 shillings, each of the value of a fraction more than 6 pence sterling. At present the Union has provided a decimal system, with coins to represent it." Unquote. The black, taking care to protect himself from losses as much as possible by the conditions of the sport, the turkey was already fastened at the mark, but its body was entirely hid by the surrounding snow. nothing being visible but its red swelling head and its long neck. If the bird was injured by any bullet that struck below the snow, it was to continue the property of its present owner; but if a feather was touched in a visible part, the animal became the prize of the successful adventurer. These terms were loudly proclaimed by the negro, who was seated in the snow in a somewhat hazardous vicinity to his favorite bird, when Elizabeth and her cousin approached the noisy sportsman. The sounds of mirth and contention sensibly lowered at this unexpected visit; but, after a moment's pause, the curious interest exhibited in the face of the young lady, together with her smiling air, restored the freedom of the morning, though it was somewhat chastened, both in language and vehemence, by the presence of such a spectator.
"Stand out the way there, boys!" cried the woodchopper, who was placing himself at the shooting point. "Stand out the way, you little rascals, or I'll shoot you through. Now, Brom, take leave of your turkey."
"Stop!" cried the young hunter. "I am a candidate for a chance. Here is my shilling, Brom. I wish to shoot too."
"You may wish it in welcome," cried Kirby; "but if I ruffle the gobbler's feathers, how are you to get it? Is money so plenty in your deerskin pocket that you pay for a chance that you may never have?"
"You know, sir, how plenty money is in my pocket," said the youth fiercely. "Here is my shilling, Brom, and I claim a right to shoot."
"Don't be crabbed, my boy,"
said the other, who was coolly fixing his flint.
"They say you have a hole in your left shoulder yourself, so I think Brom may give you a fire for half price. It will take a keen one to hit that bird, I can tell you, my lad, even if I give you a chance, which is what I have no mind to do."
"Don't be boasting, Billy Kirby," said Natty, throwing the breech of his rifle into the snow, and leaning on its barrel. "You'll get but one shot at the creature; for if the lad misses his aim, which wouldn't be a wonder if he did, with his arms so stiff and sore, you'll find a good piece and an old eye coming arter you. Maybe it's time that I can't shoot as I used to could, but 100 yards is a short distance for a long rifle."
"What, old Leatherstocking, are you out this morning?"
cried his reckless opponent.
"Well, fair play's a jewel. I've the lead of you, old fellow, so here goes for a dry throat or a good dinner."
The countenance of the negro evinced not only all the interest which his pecuniary adventure might occasion, but also the keen excitement that the sport produced in the others, though with a very different wish as to the result. While the woodchopper was slowly and steadily raising his rifle, he bawled:
Fair play, Billy Kirby, stand back. Make 'em stand back, boys. Give a nigger fair play. Poss up, gobbler. Shake a head, fool. Don't you see 'em taking aim?"
These cries, which were intended as much to distract the attention of the marksman as for anything else, were fruitless. The nerves of the woodchopper were not so easily shaken, and he took his aim with the utmost deliberation. Stillness prevailed for a moment, and he fired. The head of the turkey was seen to dash on one side, and its wings were spread in momentarily fluttering; but it settled itself down calmly into its bed of snow, and glanced its eyes uneasily around. For a time, long enough to draw a deep breath, not a sound was heard. The silence was then broken by the noises of the negro, who laughed and shook his body with all kinds of antics, rolling over in the snow in the excess of delight.
"Well done, gobbler!" he cried,
jumping up and affecting to embrace his bird.
"I tell 'em to poss up, and you see 'em dodge. Give another shilling, Billy, and have another shot."
"No, the shot is mine," said the young hunter. "You have my money already. Leave the mark, and let me try my luck." "Ah, it's but money thrown away, lad," said Leatherstocking. "A turkey's head and neck is but a small mark for a new hand and a lame shoulder. You'd best let me take the fire, and maybe we can make some settlement with the lady about the bird." "The chance is mine," said the young hunter,
clear the ground, that I may take it."
The discussions and disputes concerning the last shot were now abating, it having been determined that if the turkey's head had been anywhere but just where it was at that moment, the bird must certainly have been killed. There was not much excitement produced by the preparations of the youth, who proceeded in a hurried manner to take his aim, and was in the act of pulling the trigger, when he was stopped by Natty. "Your hand shakes, lad," he said, "and you seem over eager. Bullet wounds are apt to weaken flesh, and to my judgment you'll not shoot so well as in common. If you fire, you should shoot quick, before there is time to shake off the aim." "Fair play!" again shouted the negro. "Fair play, Gib a nigger, fair play! What right at Natty Bumpo advise a young man? Let him shoot clear a ground." The youth fired with great rapidity, but no motion was made by the turkey, and when the examiners for the ball returned from the mark, they declared that he had missed the stump. Elizabeth observed the change in his countenance, and could not help feeling surprise that one so evidently superior to his companions should feel a trifling loss so sensibly. But her own champion was now preparing to enter the list. The mirth of Brom, who had been again excited, though in a much smaller degree than before, by the failure of the second adventurer, vanished the instant Natty took his stand. His skin became mottled with large brown spots that fearfully sullied the luster of his native ebony, while his enormous lips gradually compressed around two rows of ivory that had hitherto been shining in his visage like pearls set in jet. His nostrils, at all times the most conspicuous feature of his face, dilated until they covered the greater part of the diameter of his countenance, while his brown and bony hands unconsciously grasped the snow crust near him, the excitement of the moment completely overcoming his native dread of cold. While these indications of apprehension were exhibited in the sable owner of the turkey, the man who gave rise to this extraordinary emotion was as calm and collected as if there was not to be a single spectator of his skill. "I was down in the Dutch settlements on the Schoharie," said Natty, carefully removing the leather guard from the lock of his rifle, "just before the breaking out of the last war, and there was a shooting match among the boys, so I took a hand. I think it opened a good many Dutch eyes that day when I won the powder horn, 3 bars of lead, and a pound of as good powder as ever flashed in pan. Lord! how they did swear in German! They did tell me of one drunken Dutchman who said he'd have the life of me before I got back to the lake again; but if he had put his rifle to his shoulder with evil intent, God would have punished him for it; and even if the Lord didn't, and he had missed his aim, I know one that would have given him as good as he sent, and better too, if good shooting could come into the count." By this time the old hunter was ready for his business, and throwing his right leg far behind him, and stretching his left arm along the barrel of his piece, he raised it toward the bird. Every eye glanced rapidly for the marksman to the mark, but at the moment when each ear was expecting the report of the rifle, they were disappointed by the ticking sound of the flint. "A snap! A snap!" shouted the negro, springing from his crouching posture like a madman before his bird. "A snap good as fire! Natty Bumpo gun the snap! Natty Bumpo miss a turkey!" "Natty Bumpo hit a nigger," said the indignant old hunter, "if you don't get out of the way, Brom. It's contrary to the reason of the thing, boy, that a snap should count for a fire when one is nothing more than a firestone striking a steel pan, and the other is sudden death. So get out of my way, boy, and let me show Billy Kirby how to shoot a Christmas turkey." "Give a nigger fair play!" cried the black, who continued resolutely to maintain his post, and making an appeal to the justice of his auditors, which the degraded condition of his caste so naturally suggested. "Everybody know dat snap is good as fire. Leave it to Massa Joan. Leave it to lady." "Sartain," said the wood chopper. "It's the law of the game in this part of the country, Leatherstocking. If you fire again, you must pay up the other shilling. I believe I'll try luck once more myself. So, Brom, here's my money, and I take the next fire." "It is likely you know the laws of the woods better than I do, Billy Kirby," returned Natty. "You come in with the settlers with an ox goad in your hand, and I come in with moccasins on my feet, and with a good rifle on my shoulder, so long back as afore the old war. Which is likely to know the best? So no man need tell me that snapping is as good as firing when I pull the trigger." "Leave it to Massa Joan," said the alarmed negro; "he know eberything." This appeal to the knowledge of Richard was too flattering to be unheeded. He therefore advanced a little from the spot whither the delicacy of Elizabeth had induced her to withdraw, and gave the following opinion with the gravity that the subject and his own rank demanded. "There seems to be a difference in opinion," he said, "on the subject of Nathaniel Bumpo's right to shoot at Abraham Freeborn's turkey, without the said Nathaniel paying 1 shilling for the privilege." The fact was too evident to be denied, and, after pausing a moment, that the audience might digest his premises, Richard proceeded: "It seems proper that I should decide this question, as I am bound to preserve the peace of the country, and men with deadly weapons in their hands should not be heedlessly left to contention and their own malignant passions. It appears that there was no agreement, either in writing or in words, on the disputed point. Therefore we must reason from analogy, which is, as it were, comparing one thing with another. Now, in duels where both parties shoot, it is generally the rule that a snap is a fire; and if such is the rule, where the party has a right to fire back again, it seems to me unreasonable to say that a man may stand snapping at a defenseless turkey all day. I therefore am of the opinion that Nathaniel Bumpo has lost his chance, and must pay another shilling before he renews his right." As this opinion came from so high a quarter, and was delivered with effect, it silenced all murmurs, for the whole of the spectators had begun to take sides with great warmth, except from the Leatherstocking himself. "I think Miss Elizabeth's thoughts should be taken," said Natty. "I've known the squaws give very good counsel when the Indians had been dumbfounded. If she says that I ought to lose, I agree to give it up."
"Then I adjudge you to be the loser for this time,"
said Miss Temple.
"but pay your money and renew your chance, unless Bourne will sell me the bird for $1. I will give him the money, and save the life of the poor victim."
This proposition was evidently but little relished by any of the listeners. Even the negro, feeling the evil excitement of the chances in the meanwhile, as Billy Kirby was preparing himself for another shot. Natty left the stand with an extremely dissatisfied manner, muttering: "There hasn't been such a good thing as a flint sold at the foot of the lake since the Indian traders used to come to the country; and if a body should go into the flats along the streams and the hills to hunt for such a thing, it's 10 to 1 but they will be all covered up with the plow. Hi ho! It seems to me that just as the game grows scarce, and everybody wants the best ammunition to get a livelihood, everything that's bad falls on him like a judgment. But I'll change the stone, for Billy Kirby hasn't had the eye for such a mark, I know." The wood chopper seemed now entirely sensible that his reputation depended on his care, nor did he neglect any means to insure success. He drew up his rifle and renewed his aim again and again, still appearing reluctant to fire. No shout was heard from even Brom during these portentous movements, until Kirby discharged the piece with the same want of success as before. Then, indeed, the shouts of the negro rang through the bushes, and sounded among the trees of the neighboring forest like the outcries of a tribe of Indians. He laughed, rolling his head first on one side and then on the other, until nature seemed exhausted with mirth. He danced until his legs were wearied with motion in the snow, and, in short, he exhibited all that violence of joy that characterizes the mirth of a thoughtless negro. The wood chopper had exerted all his art, and felt a proportionate degree of disappointment at the failure. He first examined the bird with the utmost attention, and more than once suggested that he had touched its feathers; but the voice of the multitude was against him. for it felt disposed to listen to the often repeated cries of the black to "give a nigger fair play." Finding it impossible to make out a title to the bird, Kirby turned fiercely to the black and said, "Shut your oven, you crow! Where is the man that can hit a turkey's head at 100 yards? I was a fool for trying. You needn't make an uproar like falling pine tree about it. Show me the man who can do it." "Look this away, Billy Kirby," said Leatherstocking, "and let them clear the mark, and I'll show you a man who's made better shots afore now, and that when he's been hard pressed by the savages and wild beasts." "Perhaps there is one of those rights come before ours, Leatherstocking," said Miss Temple. "If so, we will waive our privilege." "If it be me that you have reference to," said the young hunter, "I shall decline another chance. My shoulder is yet weak, I find." Elizabeth regarded his manner, and thought that she could discern a tinge on his cheek that spoke of the shame of conscious poverty. She said no more, but suffered her own champion to make a trial. Although Natty Bumpo had certainly made hundreds of more momentous shots at his enemies or his game, yet he never exerted himself more to excel. He raised his piece several times, once to get his range, once to calculate his distance, and once because the bird, alarmed by the deathlike stillness, turned its head quickly to examine its foes. But the fourth time he fired, the smoke, the report, and the momentary shock prevented most of the spectators from instantly knowing the result. But Elizabeth, when she saw her champion drop the end of his rifle in the snow, and open his mouth in one of its silent laughs, and then proceed very coolly to recharge his piece, knew that he had been successful. The boys rushed to the mark and lifted the turkey on high, lifeless, and with nothing but the remnant of a head. "Bring in the creature," said Leatherstocking, "and put it at the feet of the lady. I was her deputy in the matter, and the bird is her property." "And a good deputy you have proved yourself," returned Elizabeth; "so good, Cousin Richard, that I would advise you to remember his qualities." She paused, and the gayety that beamed on her face gave place to a more serious earnestness. She even blushed a little as she turned to the young hunter, and with the charm of a woman's manner added, "But it was only to see an exhibition of the far famed skill of Leatherstocking that I tried my fortunes. Will you, sir, accept the bird as a small peace offering for the hurt that prevented your own success?" The expression with which the youth received this presentment was indescribable. He appeared to yield to the blandishment of her air, in opposition to a strong impulse to the contrary. He bowed, and raised the victim silently from her feet, but continued silent. Elizabeth handed the black piece of silver as a remuneration for his loss, which had some effect in again unbending his muscles, and then expressed to her companion her readiness to return homeward. "Wait a minute, Cousin Bess," cried Richard. "There is an uncertainty about the rules of this sport that is proper I should remove. If you will appoint a committee, gentlemen, to wait on me this morning, I will draw up in writing a set of regulations." He stopped with some indignation, for at that instant a hand was laid familiarly on the shoulder of the high sheriff of "A Merry Christmas to you, Cousin Deacon," said Judge Temple, who had approached the party unperceived. "I must have a vigilant eye to my daughter, sir, if you are to be seized daily from these gallant fits. I admire the taste with which you introduce the lady to such scenes." "It is her own perversity, 'Duke," cried the disappointed sheriff, who felt the loss of the first salutation as grievously as many a man would a much greater misfortune; "and I must say that she comes honestly by it. I let her out to show her the improvements, but away she scampered through the snow at the first sound of firearms.
the same as if she had been brought up in a camp, instead of a first-rate boarding school. I do think, Judge Temple, that such dangerous amusements should be suppressed by statute. Nay, I doubt whether they are not already indictable at common law."
"Well, sir, as you are sheriff of the county, it becomes your duty to examine into the matter," returned the smiling Marmaduke. "I perceive that Bess has executed her commission, and I hope it met with a favorable reception."
Richard glanced his eyes at the packet which he held in his hand, and the slight anger produced by disappointment vanished instantly.
"Ah, 'Duke, my fair cousin," he said, "step a little on one side. I have something I will say to you."
Marmaduke complied, and the sheriff led him a little distance in the bushes, and continued:
"First, 'Duke, let me thank you for your friendly interest with the council and the governor, without which I am confident that the greatest merit would avail but little. But we are sisters' children, and you may use me like one of your horses, ride me or drive me. 'Duke, I am wholly yours; but in my humble opinion, this young companion of Leatherstocking requires looking after. He has a very dangerous propensity for turkey."
"Leave him to my management, Dickon," said the Judge, "and I will cure his appetite by indulgence. It is with him that I would speak. Let us rejoin the sportsmen."
Chapter 17. This reading by Gary W. Sherwin, of Yukon, Pennsylvania, in September of 2009.
Of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 18. Poor wretch! The mother that him bare, if she had been in presence there, in his wan face and sunburnt hair, she had not known her child. Scott. It diminished in no degree the effect produced by the conversation which passed between Judge Temple and the young hunter, that the former took the arm of his daughter and drew it through his own, when he advanced from the spot whither Richard had led him to that where the youth was standing, leaning on his rifle, and contemplating the dead bird at his feet. The presence of Marmaduke did not interrupt the sports, which were resumed by loud and clamorous disputes concerning the conditions of a chance that involved the life of a bird of much inferior quality to the last. Leatherstocking and Mohegan had alone drawn aside to their youthful companion, and, although in the immediate vicinity of such a throng, the following conversation was heard only by those who were interested in it. "I have greatly injured you, Mr. Edwards," said the Judge, but the sudden and inexplicable start with which the person spoken to received this unexpected address caused him to pause a moment. As no answer was given, and the strong emotion exhibited in the countenance of the youth gradually passed away, he continued: "But fortunately it is in some measure in my power to compensate you for what I have done. My kinsman, Richard Jones, has received an appointment that will in future deprive me of his assistance, and leave me just now destitute of one who might greatly aid me with his pen. Your manner, notwithstanding appearances, is a sufficient proof of your education, nor will thy shoulder suffer thee to labor for some time to come." Marmaduke insensibly relapsed into the language of the friends as he grew warm. "My doors are open to thee, my young friend, for in this infant country we harbor no suspicions, little offering to tempt the cupidity of the evil disposed. Become my assistant, for at least a season, and receive such compensation as thy services will deserve." There was nothing in the manner of the offer of the Judge to justify the reluctance, amounting nearly to loathing, with which the youth listened to his speech; but, after a powerful effort for self-command, he replied: "I would serve you, sir. or any other man, for an honest support; for I do not affect to conceal that my necessities are very great, even beyond what appearances would indicate. But I am fearful that such new duties would interfere too much with more important business, so that I must decline your offer, and depend on my rifle, as before, for subsistence." Richard here took occasion to whisper to the young lady, who had shrunk a little from the foreground of the picture: "This, you see, Cousin Bess, is the natural reluctance of a half breed to leave the savage state. Their attachment to a wandering life is, I verily believe, unconquerable." "It is a precarious life," observed Marmaduke, without hearing the sheriff's observation, "and one that brings more evils with it than present suffering. Trust me, young friend, my experience is greater than thine, when I tell thee that the unsettled life of these hunters is a vast disadvantage for temporal purposes, and it totally removes one from the influence of more sacred things." "No, no, Judge," interrupted the Leatherstocking, who was hitherto unseen or disregarded. "Take him into your shanty and welcome, but tell him truth. I have lived in the woods for 40 long years, and have spent 5 at a time without seeing the light of a clearing bigger than a window in the trees; and I should like to know where you'll find a man in his 68th year, who can get an easier living, for all your betterments and your deer laws. And, as for honesty, or doing what's right between man and man, I'll not turn my back to the longest winded deacon on your patent." "Thou art an exception, Leatherstocking," returned the Judge, nodding good naturedly at the hunter, "for thou hast a temperance unusual in thy class, and a hardihood exceeding thy years. But this youth is made of materials too precious to be wasted in the forest. I entreat thee to join my family, if it be but till thy arm is healed. My daughter here, who is mistress of my dwelling, will tell thee that thou art welcome." "Certainly," said Elizabeth, whose earnestness was a little checked by female reserve. "The unfortunate would be welcome at any time, but doubly so when we feel that we have occasioned the evil ourselves." "Yes," said Richard, "and if you relish turkey, young man, there are plenty in the coops, and of the best kind, I can assure you." Finding himself thus ably seconded, Marmaduke pushed his advantage to the utmost. He entered into a detail of the duties that would attend the situation, and circumstantially mentioned the reward, and all those points which are deemed of importance among men of business. The youth listened in extreme agitation. There was an evident contest in his feelings. At times he appeared to wish eagerly for the change, and then again the incomprehensible expression of disgust would cross his features, like a dark cloud obscuring a noonday sun. The Indian, in whose manner the depression of self-abasement was most powerfully exhibited, listened to the offers of the Judge with an interest that increased with each syllable. Gradually he grew nigher to the group, and when, with his keen glance, he detected the most marked evidence of yielding in the countenance of his young companion, he changed at once from his attitude and look of shame to the front of an Indian warrior, and moving, with great dignity, closer to the parties, he spoke. "Listen to your father," he said. "His words are old. Let the young eagle and the great land chief eat together. Let them sleep, without fear, near each other. The children of Miquon love not blood. They are just, and will do right. The sun must rise and set often, before men can make one family. It is not the work of a day, but of many winters. The Mingoes and the Delawares are born enemies. Their blood can never mix in the wigwam. It never will run in the same stream in the battle. What makes the brother of Miquon and the Young Eagle foes? They are of the same tribe. Their fathers and mothers are one. Learn to wait, my son. You are a Delaware, and an Indian warrior knows how to be patient." This figurative address seemed to have great weight with the young man, who gradually yielded to the representations of Marmaduke, and eventually consented to his proposal. It was, however, to be an experiment only, and, if either of the parties thought fit to rescind the engagement, it was left at his option to do so. the remarkable and ill-concealed reluctance of the youth to accept of an offer, which most men in his situation would consider as an unhoped-for elevation, occasioned no little surprise in those to whom he was a stranger, and it left a slight impression to his disadvantage. When the parties separated, they very naturally made the subject the topic of a conversation, which we shall relate, first commencing with the Judge, his daughter, and Richard, who were slowly pursuing the way back to the mansion house. "I have surely endeavored to remember the holy mandates of our Redeemer, when he bids us love them who despitefully use you, in my intercourse with this incomprehensible boy," said Marmaduke. "I know not what there is in my dwelling to frighten a lad of his years, unless it may be thy presence and visage, Bess." "No, no," said Richard, with great simplicity, "it is not Cousin Bess. But when did you ever know a half-breed, 'Duke, who could bear civilization? For that matter, they are worse than the savages themselves. Did you notice how knock-kneed he stood, Elizabeth, and what a wild look he had in his eyes?" "I heeded not his eyes, nor his knees, which would be all the better for a little humbling. Really, my dear sir, I think you did exercise the Christian virtue of patience to the utmost. I was disgusted with his airs, long before he consented to make one of our family. Truly, we are much honored by the association. In what apartment is he to be placed, sir? And at what table is he to receive his nectar and ambrosia?" "With Benjamin and Remarkable," interrupted Mr. Jones. "You sorely would not make the youth eat with the blacks. He is part Indian, it is true, but the natives hold the negroes in great contempt. No, no, he would starve before he would break a crust with the negroes." "I am but too happy, Dickon, to tempt him to eat with ourselves," said Marmaduke, "to think of offering even the indignity you propose." "Then, sir," said Elizabeth, with an air that was slightly affected, as if submitting to her father's orders in opposition to her own will, "it is your pleasure that he be a gentleman." "Certainly. He is to fill the station of one. Let him receive the treatment that is due to his place, until we find him unworthy of it." "Well, well, 'Duke," cried the sheriff, "you will find it no easy matter to make a gentleman of him. The old proverb says that it takes 3 generations to make a gentleman. There was my father, whom everybody knew my grandfather was an M.D., and his father a D.D., and his father came from England. I never could come at the truth of his origin, but he was either a great merchant in London, or a great country lawyer, or the youngest son of a bishop." "Here is a true American genealogy for you," said Marmaduke, laughing. "It does very well till you get across the water, where, as everything is obscure, it is certain to deal in the superlative. You are sure that your English progenitor was great, Dickon, whatever his profession might have been?" "To be sure I am," returned the other. "I have heard my old aunt talk of him by the month. We are of a good family, Judge Temple, and have never filled any but honorable stations in life." "I marvel that you should be satisfied with so scanty a provision of gentility in the olden time, Dickon. Most of the American genealogists commence their traditions like the stories for children, with 3 brothers, taking especial care that one of the triumvirate shall be the progenitor of any of the same name who may happen to be better furnished with worldly gear than themselves. But here all are equal who know how to conduct themselves with propriety, and Oliver Edwards comes into my family on a footing with both the high sheriff and the judge." "Well, 'Duke, I call this democracy, not republicanism. But I say nothing. Only let him keep within the law, or I shall show him that the freedom of even this country is under wholesome restraint. Surely, Dickon, you will not execute till I condemn. But what says Bess to the new inmate? We must pay a deference to the ladies in this matter, after all." "Oh, sir," returned Elizabeth, "I believe I am much like a certain Judge Temple in this particular, not easily to be turned from my opinion. But to be serious, although I must think the introduction of a demi-savage into the family is a somewhat startling event, whomsoever you think proper to countenance may be sure of my respect." The Judge drew her arm more closely in his own, and smiled, while Richard led the way through the gate of the little courtyard in the rear of the dwelling, dealing out his ambiguous warnings with his accustomed loquacity. On the other hand, the foresters, for the three hunters, notwithstanding their difference in character, well deserved this common name, pursued their course along the skirts of the village in silence. It was not until they had reached the lake, and were moving over its frozen surface toward the foot of the mountain, where the hut stood, that the youth exclaimed: "Who could have foreseen this a month since? I have consented to serve Marmaduke Temple, to be an inmate in the dwelling of the greatest enemy of my race. Yet what better could I do? The servitude cannot be long, and when the motive for submitting to it ceases to exist, I will shake it off like the dust from my feet." "Is he a Mingo that you will call him enemy?" said Mohegan. "The Delaware warrior sits still, and waits the time of the Great Spirit. He is no woman, to cry out like a child." "Well, I'm mistrustful, John," said Leatherstocking, in whose air there had been, during the whole business, a strong expression of doubt and uncertainty. "They say that there's new laws in the land, and I'm sartain that there's new ways in the mountains. One hardly knows the lakes and streams, they've altered the country so much. I must say I'm mistrustful of such smooth speakers, for I've known the whites talk fair when they wanted the Indian lands most. This I will say, though I'm a white myself, and was born nigh York, and of honest parents too." "I will submit," said the youth. "I will forget who I am, cease to remember, old Mohegan, that I am the descendant of a Delaware chief, who once was master of these noble hills, these beautiful vales, and of this water over which we tread. Yes, yes, I will become his bondsman, his slave. Is it not an honorable servitude, old man?" "Old man!" repeated the Indian solemnly, and pausing in his walk, as usual, when much excited. "Yes, John is old, son of my brother. If Mohegan was young, when would his rifle be still? Where would the deer hide, and he not find him? But John is old. His hand is the hand of a squaw. His tomahawk is a hatchet. Brooms and baskets are his enemies. He strikes no other. Hunger and old age come together. See Hawkeye. When young, he would go days and eat nothing; but should he not put the brush on the fire now, the blaze would go out. Take the son of Miquon by the hand, and he will help you." "I'm not the man I was, I'll own, Chingachgook," returned the Leatherstocking; "but I can go without a meal now, on occasion. When we tracked the Iroquois through the beech woods, they drove the game afore them, for I hadn't a morsel to eat from Monday morning come Wednesday sundown, and then I shot as fat a buck on the Pennsylvany line as ever mortal laid eyes on. It would have done your heart good to have seen the Delaware eat, for I was out scouting and scrimmaging with their tribe at the time. Lord! The Indians, lad, lay still, and just waited till Providence should send them their game, but I foraged about and put a deer up, and put him down too, afore he had made a dozen jumps. I was too weak and too ravenous to stop for his flesh, so I took a good drink of his blood, and the Indians ate of his meat raw. John was there, and John knows; but then starvation would be apt to be too much for me now, I will own, though I'm no great eater at any time." "Enough is said, my friend," cried the youth. "I feel that everywhere the sacrifice is required at my hands, and it shall be made. But say no more, I entreat you. I cannot bear this subject now." His companions were silent, and they soon reached the hut, which they entered, after removing certain complicated and ingenious fastenings that were put there apparently to guard a property of but very little value. Immense piles of snow lay against the log walls of this secluded habitation on one side, while fragments of small trees and branches of oak and chestnut, that had been torn from their parent stems by the winds, were thrown into a pile on the other. A small column of smoke rose through a chimney of sticks cemented with clay, along the side of the rock, and had marked the snow above with its dark tinges, in a wavy line from the point of emission to another, where the hill receded from the brow of a precipice, and held a soil that nourished trees of a gigantic growth, that overhung the little bottom beneath. The remainder of the day passed off as such days are commonly spent in a new country. The settlers thronged to the academy again to witness the second effort of Mr. Grant, and Mohegan was one of his hearers. But, notwithstanding the divine fixed his eyes intently on the Indian when he invited his congregation to advance to the table, the shame of last night's abasement was yet too keen in the old chief to suffer him to move. When the people were dispersing, the clouds that had been gathering all the morning were dense and dirty, and before half of the curious congregation had reached their different cabins, that were placed in every glen and hollow of the mountains, or perched on the summits of the hills themselves, the rain was falling in torrents. The dark edges of the stumps began to exhibit themselves, as the snow settled rapidly. The fences of logs and brush, which before had been only traced by long lines of white mounds that ran across the valley and up the mountains, peeped out from their covering, and the black stubs were momentarily becoming more distinct, as large masses of snow and ice fell from their sides, under the influence of the thaw. Sheltered in the warm hall of her father's comfortable mansion, Elizabeth, accompanied by Louisa Grant, looked abroad with admiration at the ever-varying face of things without. Even the village, which had just before been glittering with the color of the frozen element, reluctantly dropped its mask, and the houses exposed their dark roofs and smoked chimneys. The pines shook off the covering of snow, and everything seemed to be assuming its proper hues, with a transition that bordered on the supernatural. Chapter 18. Recording by Bill Vorst. Of the Pioneers, or the Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 19. And yet poor Edwin was no vulgar boy. Beatty. The close of Christmas Day, A.D. 1793, was tempestuous, but comparatively warm. When darkness had again hid the objects in the village from the gaze of Elizabeth, she turned from the window, where she had remained while the least vestige of light lingered over the tops of the dark pines, with a curiosity that was rather excited than appeased by the passing glimpses of woodland scenery that she had caught during the day. With her arm locked in that of Miss Grant, the young mistress of the mansion walked slowly up and down the hall, musing on scenes that were rapidly recurring to her memory, and possibly dwelling, at times, in the sanctuary of her thoughts, on the strange occurrences that had led to the introduction to her father's family of one whose manners so singularly contradicted the inferences to be drawn from his situation. The expiring heat of the apartment, for its great size required a day to reduce its temperature, had given to her cheeks a bloom that exceeded their natural color, while the mild and melancholy features of Louisa were brightened with a faint tinge that, like the hectic of disease, gave a painful interest to her beauty. The eyes of the gentlemen, who were yet seated around the rich wines of Judge Temple, frequently wandered from the table, that was placed at one end of the hall, to the forms that were silently moving over its length. Much mirth, and that, at times, of a boisterous kind, proceeded from the mouth of Richard. But Major Hartmann was not yet excited to his pitch of merriment, and Marmaduke respected the presence of his clerical guests too much to indulge in even the innocent humor that formed no small ingredient in his character. Such were, and such continued to be, the pursuits of the party, for half an hour after the shutters were closed, and candles were placed in various parts of the hall, as substitutes for departing daylight. The appearance of Benjamin, staggering under the burden of an armful of wood, was the first interruption to this scene. "How now, Master Pump?" roared the newly appointed sheriff. Is there not warmth enough in 'Duke's best Madeira to keep up the animal heat through this thaw? Remember, old boy, that the Judge is particular with his beech and maple, beginning to dread already a scarcity of the precious articles. Ha, ha, ha! 'Duke, you are a good warm-hearted relation, I will own, as in duty bound, but you have some queer notions about you, after all. Come, let us be jolly, and cast away folly." The notes gradually sank into a hum, while the major domo threw down his load, and, turning to his interrogator, with an air of earnestness, replied: "Why, look you, Squire Dickon, mayhap there's a warm latitude round about the table there, though it's not the stuff to raise the heat in my body, neither; the rale Jamaiky being the only thing to do that, besides good wood, or some such matter as Newcastle coal. But if I know anything of the weather, d'ye see, it's time to be getting all snug, and for putting the ports in, and stirring the fires a bit. Mayhap I've not followed the seas 27 years, and lived another 7 in these here woods, for nothing, gemmen." "Why, does it bid fair for a change in the weather, Benjamin?" inquired the master of the house. "There's a shift of wind, your honor," returned the steward, "and when there's a shift of wind, you may look for a change in this here climate. I was aboard one of Rodney's fleet, d'ye see, about the time we licked De Grasse, Monsieur Lorquois' countryman, there, and the wind was here at the south'ard and east'ard, and I was below mixing a toothful of hot stuff for the captain of marines, who dined, d'ye see, in the cabin that there very same day, and I suppose he wanted to put out the captain's fire with a gun-room ingin', and so, just as I got it to my own liking, after tasting pretty often, for the soldier was difficult to please, slap came the foresail ag'in the mast, whiz went the ship around on her heel like a whirligig, and a lucky thing was it that our helm was down, for as she gathered starnway, she paid off, which was more than every ship in the fleet did, or could do. But she strained herself in the trough of the sea, and she shipped a deal of water over her quarter. I never swallowed so much clear water at a time in my life as I did then, for I was looking up the after hatch at the instant." "I wonder, Benjamin, that you did not die with a dropsy," said Marmaduke. "I mought, Judge," said the old tar, with a broad grin; "but there was no need of the medicine chest for a cure, for as I thought the brew was spoiled for the marine's taste, and there was no telling when another sea might come and spoil it for mine, I finished the mug on the spot. So then all hands was called to the pumps, and there we began to ply the pumps." "Well, but the weather?" interrupted Marmaduke. "What of the weather without doors?" "Why, here the wind has been all day at the south, and now there's a lull, as if the last blast was out of the bellows, and there's a streak along the mountains to the north'ard, that just now wasn't wider than the bigness of your hand, and then the clouds drive afore it as you'd brail a mainsail, and the stars are heaving in sight like so many lights and beacons, put there to warn us to pile on the wood. And if so be that I'm a judge of weather, it's getting to be time to build on a fire, or you'll have half of them there porter bottles, and them demijohns of wine in the locker here breaking with the frost, afore the morning watch is called." "Thou art a prudent sentinel," said the Judge. "Act thy pleasure with the forests for this night at feast." Benjamin did as he was ordered, nor had 2 hours elapsed before the prudence of his precautions became very visible. The south wind had indeed blown itself out, and it was succeeded by the calmness that usually gave warning of a serious change in the weather. Long before the family retired to rest, the cold had become cuttingly severe, and when Monsieur Le Quoi sallied forth under a bright moon to seek his own abode, he was compelled to beg a blanket, in which he might envelop his form, in addition to the numerous garments that his sagacity had provided for the occasion. The divine and his daughter remained as inmates of the mansion house during the night, and the excess of last night's merriment induced the gentlemen to make an early retreat to their several apartments. Long before midnight the whole family were invisible. Elizabeth and her friend had not yet lost their senses in sleep, and the howlings of the northwest wind were heard around the buildings, and brought with them that exquisite sense of comfort that is ever excited under such circumstances, in an apartment where the fire has not yet ceased to glimmer, and curtains, and shutters, and feathers unite to preserve the desired temperature. Once, Just as her eyes had opened, apparently in the last stage of drowsiness, the roaring winds brought with them a long and plaintive howl, that seemed too wild for a dog, and yet resembled the cries of that faithful animal, when night awakens his vigilance and gives sweetness and solemnity to its charms. The form of Louisa Grant instinctively pressed nearer to that of the young heiress, who, finding her companion was yet awake, said in a low tone, as if afraid to break a charm with her voice: "Those distant cries are plaintive, and even beautiful. Can they be the hounds from the hut of Leatherstocking?" "They are wolves, who have ventured from the mountain on the lake," whispered Louisa, "and who are only kept from the village by the lights. One night since we have been here, hunger drove them to our very door. Oh, what a dreadful night it was! But the riches of Judge Temple have given him too many safeguards to leave room for fear in this house." "The enterprise of Judge Temple is taming the very forests," exclaimed Elizabeth, throwing off her covering, and partly rising in the bed. "How rapidly is civilization treading on the foot of nature!" she continued, as her eye glanced over not only the comforts, but the luxuries of her apartment, and her ear again listened to the distant, but often repeated howls from the lake. Finding, however, that the timidity of her companion rendered the sounds painful to her, Elizabeth resumed her place, and soon forgot the changes in the country, with those in her own condition, in a deep sleep. The following morning, the noise of the female servant, who entered the apartment to light the fire, awoke the females. They arose, and finished the slight preparations of their toilets in a clear, cold atmosphere, that penetrated through all the defences of even Miss Temple's warm room. When Elizabeth was attired, she approached a window and drew its curtain, and, throwing open its shutters, she endeavored to look abroad on the village and the lake. But a thick covering of frost on the glass, while it admitted the light, shut out the view. She raised the sash, and then, indeed, a glorious scene met her delighted eye. The lake had exchanged its covering of unspotted snow for a face of dark ice, that reflected the rays of the rising sun like a polished mirror. The houses, clothed in a dress of the same description, but which, owing to its position, shone like bright steel, while the enormous icicles that were pendent from every roof caught the brilliant light, apparently throwing it from one to the other, as each glittered, on the side next the luminary, with a golden lustre that melted away, on its opposite, into the dusky shades of a background. But it was the appearance of the boundless forests that covered the hills as they rose in the distance, one over the other, that most attracted the gaze of Miss Temple. The huge branches of the pines and hemlocks bent with the weight of the ice they supported, while their summits rose above the swelling tops of the oaks, beeches, and maples, like spires of burnished silver issuing from domes of the same material. The limits of the view, in the west, were marked by an undulating outline of bright light, as if reversing the order of nature. Numberless suns might momentarily be expected to heave above the horizon. In the foreground of the picture, along the shores of the lake, and near to the village, each tree seemed studded with diamonds. Even the sides of the mountains, where the rays of the sun could not yet fall, were decorated with a glassy coat, that presented every gradation of brilliancy, from the first touch of the luminary to the dark foliage of the hemlock, glistening through its coat of crystal. In short, the whole view was one scene of quivering radiancy, as lake, mountains, village, and woods each emitted a portion of light, tinged with its peculiar hue, and varied by its position and its magnitude. "See!" cried Elizabeth, "see, Louisa! Hasten to the window and observe the miraculous change." Miss Grant complied, and, after bending for a moment in silence from the opening, she observed in a low tone, as if afraid to trust the sound of her voice: "The change is indeed wonderful. I am surprised that he should be able to effect it so soon." Elizabeth turned in amazement, to hear so skeptical a sentiment from one educated like her companion, but was surprised to find that, instead of looking at the view, the mild blue eyes of Miss Grant were dwelling on the form of a well-dressed young man, who was standing before the door of the building, in earnest conversation with her father. A second look was necessary before she was able to recognize the person of the young hunter in a plain, but assuredly the ordinary, garb of a gentleman. "Everything in this magical country seems to border on the marvelous," said Elizabeth; "and among all the changes, this is certainly not the least wonderful. The actors are as unique as the scenery." Miss Grant colored and drew in her head. "I am a simple country girl, Miss Temple, and I am afraid you will find me but a poor companion," she said. I am not sure that I understand all you say, but I really thought that you wished me to notice the alteration in Mr. Edwards. Is it not more wonderful when we recollect his origin? They say he is part Indian." "He is a genteel savage. But let us go down, and give the sachem his tea, for I suppose he is a descendant of King Philip, if not a grandson of Pocahontas." The ladies were met in the hall by Judge Temple, who took his daughter aside to apprise her of that alteration in the appearance of their new inmate, with which she was already acquainted. "He appears reluctant to converse on his former situation," continued Marmaduke, "but I gathered from his discourse, as is apparent from his manner, that he has seen better days, and I am really inclining to the opinion of Richard as to his origin; for it was no unusual thing for the Indian agents to rear their children in a laudable manner, and—" "Very well, my dear sir," interrupted his daughter, laughing and averting her eyes, "it is all well enough, I dare say, but, as I do not understand a word of the Mohawk language, he must be content to speak English; and as for his behavior, I trust to your discernment to control it." "Ay, but, Bess," cried the Judge, detaining her gently by the hand, "nothing must be said to him of his past life. This he has begged particularly of me as a favor. He is, perhaps, a little soured just now with his wounded arm. The injury seems very light; at another time he may be more communicative." "Oh, I am not much troubled, sir, with that laudable thirst after knowledge that is called curiosity. I shall believe him to be the child of Cornstalk, or Cornplanter, or some other renowned chieftain, possibly of the Big Snake himself, and shall treat him as such until he sees fit to shave his good looking head, borrow some half-dozen pair of my best earrings, shoulder his rifle again, and disappear as suddenly as he made his entrance. So come, my dear sir, and let us not forget the rights of hospitality, for the short time he is to remain with us." Judge Temple smiled at the playfulness of his child, and taking her arm they entered the breakfast parlor, where the young hunter was seated with an air that showed his determination to domesticate himself in the family with as little parade as possible. Such were the incidents that led to this extraordinary increase in the family of Judge Temple, where, having once established the youth, the subject of our tale requires us to leave him for a time, to pursue with diligence and intelligence the employments that were assigned him by Marmaduke. Major Hartmann made his customary visit, and took his leave of the party for the next 3 months. Mr. Grant was compelled to be absent most of his time in remote parts of the country, and his daughter became almost a constant visitor at the mansion house. Richard entered, with his constitutional eagerness, on the duties of his new office; and, as Marmaduke was much employed with the constant applications of adventures for farms, the winter passed swiftly away. The lake was the principal scene for the amusements of the young people, where the ladies, in their one-horse cutter, driven by Richard, and attended, when the snow would admit of it, by young Edwards on his skates, spent many hours taking the benefit of exercise in the clear air of the hills. The reserve of the youth gradually gave way to time and his situation, though it was still evident, to a close observer, that he had frequent moments of bitter and intense feeling. Elizabeth saw many large openings appear in the sides of the mountains during the 3 succeeding months, where different settlers had, in the language of the country, made their pitch, while the numberless sleighs that passed through the village, loaded with wheat and barrels of potashes, afforded a clear demonstration that all these labors were not undertaken in vain. In short, the whole country was exhibiting the bustle of a thriving settlement, where the highways were thronged with sleighs, bearing piles of rough household furniture, studded here and there with the smiling faces of women and children, happy in the excitement of novelty, or with loads of produce, hastening to the common market at Albany, that served as so many snares to induce the emigrants to enter into those wild mountains in search of competence and happiness. The village was alive with business, the artisans increasing in wealth with the prosperity of the country, and each day witnessing some nearer approach to the manners and usages of an old settled town. The man who carried the mail, or the post as he was called, talked much of running a stage, and once or twice during the winter he was seen taking a single passenger, in his cutter, through the snowbanks, toward the Mohawk, along which a regular vehicle glided, semi-weekly, with the velocity of lightning, and under the direction of a knowing whip from the down countries. Toward spring, divers families, who had been into the old States to see their relatives, returned in time to save the snow, frequently bringing with them whole neighborhoods, who were tempted by their representations to leave the farms of Connecticut and Massachusetts to make a trial of fortune in the woods. During all this time, Oliver Edwards, whose sudden elevation excited no surprise in that changeful country, was earnestly engaged in the service of Marmaduke, during the days, but his nights were often spent in the hut of Leatherstocking. The intercourse between the three hunters was maintained with a certain air of mystery, it is true, but with much zeal and apparent interest to all the parties. Even Mohicans seldom came to the mansion house, and Natty never, but Edwards sought every leisure moment to visit his former abode, from which he would often return in the gloomy hours of night, through the snow, or, if detained beyond the time at which the family retired to rest, with the morning sun. These visits certainly excited much speculation in those to whom they were known, but no comments were made, excepting occasionally in whispers from Richard, who would say, "It is not at all remarkable. A half-breed can never be weaned from the savage ways, and, for one of his lineage, the boy is much nearer civilization than could in reason be expected." Chapter 19. Recording by Bill Borst. Of the Pioneers, or The Sources of the Susquehanna, a Descriptive Tale, by James Fenimore Cooper. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 20. Away! Nor let me loiter in my song, for we have many a mountain path to tread. Byron. As the spring gradually approached, the immense piles of snow that, by alternate thaws and frosts, and repeated storms, had obtained a firmness which threatened a tiresome durability, began to yield to the influence of milder breezes and a warmer sun. The gates of heaven at times seemed to open, and a bland air diffused itself over the earth, when animate and inanimate nature would awaken, and for a few hours the gaiety of spring shone in every eye and smiled on every field. But the shivering blasts from the north would carry their chill influence over the scene again, and the dark and gloomy clouds that intercepted the rays of the sun were not more cold and dreary than the reaction. These struggles between the seasons became daily more frequent, while the earth, like a victim to contention, slowly lost the animated brilliancy of winter, without obtaining the aspect of spring. Several weeks were consumed in this cheerless manner, during which the inhabitants of the country gradually changed their pursuits from the social and bustling movements of the time of snow to the laborious and domestic engagements of the coming season. The village was no longer thronged with visitors. The trade that had enlivened the shops for several months began to disappear. The highways lost their shining coats of beaten snow in impassable sloughs, and were deserted by the gay and noisy travelers who, in sleighs, had, during the winter, glided along their windings; and, in short, everything seemed indicative of a mighty change, not only in the earth, but in those who derived their sources of comfort and happiness from its bosom. The younger members of the family in the mansion house, of which Louisa Grant was now habitually one, were by no means indifferent observers of these fluctuating and tardy changes. While the snow rendered the roads passable, they had partaken largely in the amusements of the winter, which included not only daily rides over the mountains, and through every valley within 20 miles of them, but divers ingenious and varied sources of pleasure on the bosom of their frozen lake. There had been excursions in the equipage of Richard, when with his 4 horses he had outstripped the winds, as it flew over the glassy ice which invariably succeeded a thaw. Then the exciting and dangerous whirligig would be suffered to possess its moment of notice. Cutters, drawn by a single horse, and hand sleds, impelled by the gentlemen on skates, would each in turn be used; and, in short, every source of relief against the tediousness of a winter in the mountains was resorted to by the family. Elizabeth was compelled to acknowledge to her father that the season, with the aid of his library, was much less irksome than she had anticipated. As exercise in the open air was in some degree necessary to the habits of the family, when the constant recurrence of frosts and thaws rendered the roads, which were dangerous at the most favorable times, utterly impassable for wheels, saddle horses were used as substitutes for other conveyances. Mounted on small and sure-footed beasts, the ladies would again attempt the passages of the mountains, and penetrate into every retired glen where the enterprise of a settler had induced him to establish himself. In these excursions they were attended by some one or all of the gentlemen of the family, as their different pursuits admitted. Young Edwards was hourly becoming more familiarized to his situation, and not infrequently mingled in the parties with an unconcern and gaiety that for a short time would expel all unpleasant recollections from his mind. Habit, and the buoyancy of youth, seemed to be getting the ascendancy over the secret causes of his uneasiness, though there were moments when the same remarkable expression of disgust would cross his intercourse with Marmaduke that had distinguished their conversations in the first days of their acquaintance. It was at the close of the month of March that the sheriff succeeded in persuading his cousin and her young friend to accompany him on a ride to a hill that was said to overhang the lake in a manner peculiar to itself. "Besides, Cousin Bess," continued the indefatigable Richard, "we will stop and see the sugar bush of Billy Kirby. He is on the east end of the Ransom lot, making sugar for Jared Ransom. There is not a better hand over a kettle in the county than that same Kirby. You remember, 'Duke, that I had him his first season in our camp, and it is not a wonder that he knows something of his trade." "He's a good chopper, is Billy," observed Benjamin, who held the bridle of the horse while the sheriff mounted; "and he handles an axe much the same as a forecastleman does his marlingspike, or a tailor his goose. They say he'll lift a potash kettle off the arch alone, though I can't say that I've ever seen him do it with my own eyes; but that is the say. And I've seen sugar of his making, which maybe wasn't as white as an old topgallant sail, but which my friend Mistress Pettibones within there said had the true molasses smack to it. And you are not the one, Squire Dickens, to be told that Mistress Remarkable has a remarkable tooth for sweet things in her nut grinder." The loud laugh that succeeded the wit of Benjamin, and in which he participated with no very harmonious sounds himself, very fully illustrated the congenial temper which existed between the pair. Most of its point was, however, lost on the rest of the party, who were either mounting their horses or assisting the ladies at the moment. When all were safely in their saddles, they moved through the village in great order. They paused for a moment before the door of Monsieur Le Quoi, until he could bestride his steed, and then, issuing from the little cluster of houses, they took one of the principal of those highways that centered in the village. As each night brought with it a severe frost, which the heat of the succeeding day served to dissipate, the equestrians were compelled to proceed singly along the margin of the road, where the turf and firmness of the ground gave the horses a secure footing. Very trifling indications of vegetation were to be seen, the surface of the earth presenting a cold, wet, and cheerless aspect that chilled the blood. The snow yet lay scattered over most of those distant clearings that were visible in different parts of the mountains, though here and there an opening might be seen where, as the white covering yielded to the season, the bright and lively green of the wheat served to enkindle the hopes of the husbandman. Nothing could be more marked than the contrast between the earth and the heavens; for, while the former presented the dreary view that we have described, a warm and invigorating sun was dispensing his heats from a sky that contained but a solitary cloud, and through an atmosphere that softened the colors of the sensible horizon until it shone like a sea of blue. Richard led the way on this, as on all other occasions that did not require the exercise of unusual abilities, and as he moved along he essayed to enliven the party with the sounds of his experienced voice. "This is your true sugar weather, 'Duke," he cried; "a frosty night and a sunshiny day. I warrant me that the sap runs like a mill tail up the maples this warm morning. It is a pity, Judge, that you do not introduce a little more science into the manufactory of sugar among your tenants. It might be done, sir, without knowing as much as Dr. Franklin. It might be done, Judge Temple." "The first object of my solicitude, friend Jones," returned Marmaduke, "is to protect the sources of this great mine of comfort and wealth from the extravagance of the people themselves. When this important point shall be achieved, it will be in season to turn our attention to an improvement in the manufacture of the article. But thou knowest, Richard, that I have already subjected our sugar to the process of the refiner, and that the result has produced loaves as white as the snow on yon fields, and possessing the saccharine quality in its utmost purity." "Saccharine, or turpentine, or any other ine, Judge Temple, you have never made a loaf larger than a good-sized sugar-plum," returned the sheriff. "Now, sir, I assert that no experiment is fairly tried until it be reduced to practical purposes. If, sir, I owned 100, or, for that matter, 200,000 acres of land, as you do, I would build a sugar house in the village. I would invite learned men to an investigation of the subject, and such are easily to be found, sir. Yes, sir, they are not difficult to find, men who unite theory with practice, and I would select a wood of young and thrifty trees, and instead of making loaves of the size of a lump of candy, damn me, 'Duke, but I'd have them as big as a haycock." "And purchase the cargo of one of those ships that they say are going to China," cried Elizabeth. "Turn your potash kettles into teacups, the scows on the lake into saucers, bake your cake in yonder lime kiln, and invite the county to a tea party. How wonderful are the projects of genius! Really, sir, the world is of opinion that Judge Temple has tried the experiment fairly, though he did not cause his loaves to be cast in moulds of the magnitude that would suit your magnificent conceptions." "You may laugh, Cousin Elizabeth, you may laugh, madam," retorted Richard, turning himself so much in his saddle as to face the party, and making dignified gestures with his whip; "but I appeal to common sense, good sense, or, what is of more importance than either, to the sense of taste, which is one of the 5 natural senses. Whether a big loaf of sugar is not likely to contain a better illustration of a proposition than such a lump as one of your Dutch women puts under her tongue when she drinks her tea. There are 2 ways of doing everything, the right way and the wrong way. You make sugar now, I will admit, and you may possibly make loaf sugar, but I take the question to be, whether you make the best possible sugar, and in the best possible loaves." "Thou art very right, Richard," observed Marmaduke, with a gravity in his air that proved how much he was interested in the subject. "It is very true that we manufacture sugar, and the inquiry is quite useful. How much, and in what manner? I hope to live to see the day when farms and plantations shall be devoted to this branch of business. Little is known concerning the properties of the tree itself, the source of all this wealth, how much it may be improved by cultivation, by the use of the hoe and plough." "Hoe and plough!" roared the sheriff. "Would you set a man hoeing around the root of a maple like this?" pointing to one of the noble trees that occur so frequently in that part of the country. "Hoeing trees! Are you mad, 'Duke? This is next to hunting for coal. Poh! My dear cousin, hear reason, and leave the management of the sugar bush to me. Here is Mr. Le Quoi. He has been in the West Indies, and has seen sugar made. Let him give an account of how it is made there, and you will hear the philosophy of the thing. Well, monsieur, how is it that you make sugar in the West Indies? Anything in Judge Temple's fashion?" The gentleman to whom this query was put was mounted on a small horse, of no very fiery temperament, and was riding with his stirrups so short as to bring his knees, while the animal rose a small ascent in the wood path they were now travelling, into a somewhat hazardous vicinity to his chin. There was no room for gesticulation or grace in the delivery of his reply, for the mountain was steep and slippery, and although the Frenchman had an eye of uncommon magnitude on either side of his face, They did not seem to be half competent to forewarn him of the impediments of bushes, twigs, and fallen trees that were momentarily crossing his path. With one hand employed in averting these dangers, and the other grasping his bridle to check an untoward speed that his horse was assuming, the native of France responded as follows: "Sucre. They do make sucre in Martinique, mais, ce n'est pas one tree vat you call, je voudrais que ces chemins fonce au diable, vat you call, stick pour la promenade?" "Cane," said Elizabeth, smiling at the imprecation, which the wary Frenchman supposed was understood only by himself. "Oui, mamselle, cane." "Yes, yes," cried Richard, "cane is the vulgar name for it, but the real term is saccharum officinarum, and what we call the sugar, or hard maple, is acer saccharinum. These are the learned names, monsieur, and are such as, doubtless, you well understand." "Is this Greek or Latin, Mr. Edwards?" whispered Elizabeth to the youth, who was opening a passage for herself and her companions through the bushes; "or perhaps it is a still more learned language, for an interpretation of which we must look to you." The dark eye of the young man glanced toward the speaker, but its resentful expression changed in a moment. "I shall remember your doubts, Miss Temple, when next I visit my old friend Mohegan, and either his skill or that of Leatherstocking shall solve them." "And are you then really ignorant of their language?" "Not absolutely, but the deep learning of Mr. Jones is more familiar to me, or even the polite masquerade of Monsieur Le Quoi." "Do you speak French?" said the lady, with quickness. "It is a common language with the Iroquois, and through the Canadas," he answered, smiling. "Ah, but they are Mingoes, and your enemies." "It will be well for me if I have no worse," said the youth, dashing ahead with his horse, and putting an end to the evasive dialogue. The discourse, however, was maintained with great vigor by Richard, until they reached an open wood on the summit of the mountain, where the hemlocks and pines totally disappeared, and a grove of the very trees that formed the subject of debate covered the earth with their tall, straight trunks and spreading branches, in stately pride. The underwood had been entirely removed from this grove, or bush, as, in conjunction with the simple arrangements for boiling, it was called, and a wide space of many acres was cleared, which might be likened to the dome of a mighty temple, to which the maples formed the columns, their tops composing the capitals, and the heavens the arch. A deep and careless incision had been made into each tree near its root, into which little spouts, formed of the bark of the alder, or of the sumac, were fastened; and a trough, roughly dug out of the linden, or basswood, was lying at the root of each tree, to catch the sap that flowed from this extremely wasteful and inartificial arrangement. The party paused a moment, on gaining the flat, to breathe their horses, and, as the scene was entirely new to several of their number, to view the manner of collecting the fluid. A fine, powerful voice aroused them from their momentary silence, as it rang under the branches of the trees, singing the following words of that inimitable doggerel, whose verses, if extended, would reach from the caters of the Connecticut to the shores of Ontario. The tune was, of course, a familiar air, which, although it is said to have been first applied to this nation in derision, circumstances have since rendered so glorious that no American ever hears its jingling cadence without feeling a thrill at his heart. "The eastern states be full of men, the western full of woods, sir, the hill be like a cattle pen, the roads be full of goods, sir, then flow away my sweety sap, and I will make you boily, nor catch a woodman's hasty nap, for fear you should get roily. The maple tree's a precious one, 'tis fuel, food, and timber, and when your stiff day's work is done, its juice will make you limber. Then flow away my sweety sap, and I will make you boily, nor catch a woodman's hasty nap, for fear you should get roily. And what's a man without his glass, his wife without her tea, sir? But neither cup nor mug will pass without his honey bee, sir. Then flow away my sweety sap, and I will make you boily, nor catch a woodman's hasty nap, for fear you should get roily." During the execution of this sonorous doggerel, Richard kept time with his whip on the mane of his charger, accompanying the gestures with a corresponding movement of his head and body. Toward the close of the song he was overheard humming the chorus, and at its last repetition to strike in at Sweetie Sap, and carry a second through, with a prodigious addition to the effect of the noise, if not to that of the harmony. "Well done us!" roared the sheriff, on the same key with the tune. "A very good song, Billy Kirby, and very well sung. Where got you the words, lad? Is there more of it, and can you furnish me with a copy?" The sugar boiler, who was busy in his camp at a short distance from the equestrians, turned his head with great indifference and surveyed the party, as they approached, with admirable coolness. To each individual, as he or she rode close by him, he gave a nod that was extremely good-natured and affable, but which partook largely of the virtue of equality, for not even to the ladies did he in the least vary his mode of salutation, by touching the apology for a hat that he wore, or by any other motion than the one we have mentioned. "How goes it, Sheriff?" said the wood chopper. "What's the good word in the village?" "Why, much as usual, Billy," returned Richard. "But how is this? Where are your 4 kettles, and your troughs, and your iron coolers? Do you make sugar in this slovenly way? I thought you were one of the best sugar boilers in the county." "I'm all that, Squire Jones," said Kirby, who continued his occupation. "I'll turn my back to no man in the Otsego hills for chopping and logging, for boiling down the maple sap, for tending brick kiln, splitting out rails, making potash, and parling too, or hoeing corn, though I keep myself pretty much to the first business, seeing that the axe comes most natural to me." "You be von jack all trade, Mister Bill," said Monsieur Le Quoi. "How?" said Kirby, looking up with a simplicity which, coupled with his gigantic frame and manly face, was a little ridiculous. "If you be for trade, monsieur, here is some as good sugar as you'll find the season through. It's as clear from dirt as the Jarman Flats is free from stumps, and it has the rale maple flavor. Such stuff would sell in York for candy." The Frenchman approached the place where Kirby had deposited his cake of sugar, under the cover of a bark roof, and commenced the examination of the article with the eye of one who well understood its value. Marmaduke had dismounted, and was viewing the works and the trees very closely, and not without frequent expressions of dissatisfaction at the careless manner in which the manufacture was conducted. "You have much experience in these things, Kirby," he said. "What course do you pursue in making your sugar? I see you have but 2 kettles." "2 is as good as 2,000, Judge. I'm none of your polite sugar makers, that boils for the great folks; but if the rale sweet maple is wanted, I can answer your turn. First, I choose, and then I tap my trees. Say along about the last of February, or in these mountains, maybe not afore the middle of March; but anyway, just as the sap begins to cleverly run." "Well, in this choice," interrupted Marmaduke, "are you governed by any outward signs that prove the quality of the tree?" "Why, there's judgment in all things," said Kirby, stirring the liquor in his kettles briskly. "There's something in knowing when and how to stir the pot. It's a thing that must be learnt. Rome wasn't built in a day, nor for that matter Templeton either, though it may be said to be a quick growing place. I never put my axe into a stunty tree, or one that hasn't a good, fresh looking bark, for trees have disorders like creatures; and where's the policy of taking a tree that's sickly, any more than you'd choose a foundered horse to ride post, or an overheated ox to do your logging?" "All that is true; but what are the signs of illness? How do you distinguish a tree that is well from one that is diseased?" "How does the doctor tell who has fever and who colds?" interrupted Richard. "By examining the skin, and feeling the pulse, to be sure." "Sartain," continued Billy, "the squire ain't far out of the way. It's by the look of the thing, sure enough. Well, when the sap begins to get a free run, I hang over the kettles and set up the bush. My first boiling I push pretty smartly, till I get the virtue of the sap; but when it begins to grow of a molasses natur', like this one in the kettle, one mustn't drive the fires too hard, or you'll burn the sugar, and burny sugar is bad to the taste, let it be never so sweet. So you ladle out from one kettle into the other till it gets so, when you put the stirring stick into it, that it will draw into a thread, when it takes a careful hand to manage it. There is a way to drain it off, after it has grained, by putting clay into the pans, but it isn't always practised. Some does and some doesn't. Well, monsieur, be we likely to make a trade? I will give you, Mr. Etel, for 1 pound, 10 sous. No, I expect cash for it. I never dicker my sugar. But seeing that it's you, monsieur, said Billy with a coaxing smile, I'll agree to receive a gallon of rum, and cloth enough for 2 shirts, if you'll take the molasses in the bargain. It's real good. I wouldn't deceive you or any man, and to my drinking, it's about the best molasses that come out of a sugar bush. Mr. Le Quoi has offered you 10 pence, said young Edwards. The manufacturer stared at the speaker with an air of great freedom, but made no reply. Oui, said the Frenchman, 10 penny. Je vous remercie, monsieur. Ah, mon Anglois, je l'oublie toujours. The woodchopper looked from one to the other with some displeasure, and evidently imbibed the opinion that they were amusing themselves at his expense. He seized the enormous ladle, which was lying on one of his kettles, and began to stir the boiling liquid with great diligence. After a moment passed in dipping the ladle full, and then raising it on high, as the thick, rich fluid fell back into the kettle, he suddenly gave it a whirl, as if to cool what yet remained, and offered the bowl to Mr. Le Quoi, saying, "Taste that, monsieur, and you will say it is worth more than you offer. The molasses itself would fetch the money." The complacent Frenchman, after several timid efforts to trust his lips in contact with the bowl of the ladle, got a good swallow of the scalding liquid. He clapped his hands on his breast, and looked most piteously at the ladies for a single instant, and then, to use the language of Billy, when he afterward recounted the tale, no drumsticks ever went faster on the skin of a sheep than the Frenchman's legs for a round or two. And then such swearing and spitting in French you never saw. But it's a knowing one, from the old countries, that thinks to get his jokes smoothly over a woodchopper. The air of innocence with which Kirby resumed the occupation of stirring the contents of his kettles would have completely deceived the spectators as to his agency in the temporary sufferings of Mr. Le Quoi, had not the reckless fellow thrust his tongue into his cheek, and cast his eyes over the party with a simplicity of expression that was too exquisite to be natural. Mr. Le Quoi soon recovered his presence of mind and his decorum, and he briefly apologized to the ladies for one or two very intemperate expressions that had escaped him in a moment of extraordinary excitement, and, remounting his horse, he continued in the background during the remainder of the visit, the wit of Kirby putting a violent termination at once to all negotiations on the subject of trade. During all this time Marmaduke had been wandering about the grove, making observations on his favorite trees, and the wasteful manner in which the woodchopper conducted his manufacture. "It grieves me to witness the extravagance that pervades this country," said the Judge, "where the settlers trifle with the blessings they might enjoy, with the prodigality of successful adventurers. You are not exempt from the censure yourself, Kirby, for you make dreadful wounds in these trees where a small incision would effect the same object. I earnestly beg you will remember that they are the growth of centuries, and when once gone none living will see their loss remedied." "Why, I don't know, Judge," returned the man he addressed. "It seems to me, if there's plenty of anything in this mountaneous country, it's the trees. If there's any sin in chopping them, I've a pretty heavy account to settle, for I've chopped over the best half of 1,000 acres, with my own hands, counting both Vermont and York States, and I hope to live to finish the whole, before I lay up my axe. Chopping comes quite natural to me, and I wish no other employment. But Jared Ransom said that he thought the sugar was likely to be scarce this season, seeing that so many folks was coming into the settlement, and so I concluded to take the bush on shears for this one spring. What's the best news, Judge, concerning ashes? Do pots hold so that a man can live by them still? I suppose they will, if they keep on fighting across the water." "Thou reasonest with judgment, William," returned Marmaduke. "So long as the old worm is to be convulsed with wars, so long will the harvest of America continue." "Well, it's an ill wind, Judge, that blows nobody any good. I'm sure the country is in a thriving way; and though I know you calculate greatly on the trees, setting as much store by them as some men would by their children, yet to my eyes they are a sore sight any time, unless I'm privileged to work my will on them; in which case I can't say but they are more to my liking. I have heard the settlers from the old countries say that their rich men keep great oaks and elms that would make a barrel of pots to the tree, standing round their doors and homesteads, and scattered over their farms, just to look at. Now I call no country much improved that is pretty well covered with trees. Stumps are a different thing, for they don't shade the land, and besides, you dig them, they make a fence that will turn anything bigger than a hog, being grand for breechy cattle." "Opinions on such subjects vary much in different countries," said Marmaduke, "but it is not as ornaments that I value the noble trees of this country. It is for their usefulness. We are stripping the forests, as if a single year would replace what we destroy; but the hour approaches when the laws will take notice of not only the woods, but the game they contain also." With this consoling reflection Marmaduke remounted, and the equestrians passed the sugar camp, on their way to the promised landscape of Richard. The wood chopper was left alone, in the bosom of the forest, to pursue his labors. Elizabeth turned her head when they reached the point where they were to descend the mountain, and thought that the slow fires that were glimmering under his enormous kettles, his little brush shelter, covered with pieces of hemlock bark, his gigantic size as he wielded his ladle with a steady and knowing air, aided by the background of stately trees, with their spouts and troughs, formed, altogether, no unreal picture of human life in its first stages of civilization. Perhaps whatever the scene possessed of a romantic character was not injured by the powerful tones of Kirby's voice ringing through the woods, as he again awoke his strains to another tune, which was but little more scientific than the former. All that she understood of the words were: "And when the proud forest is falling, to my oxen cheerfully calling, from morn until night I am bawling, woe back there, and haw and gee, till our labor is mutually ended, by my strength and cattle befriended, and against the mosquitoes defended by the bark of the walnut trees. Away, then, you lads who would buy land, choose the oak that grows on the high land, or the silvery pine on the dry land, it matters but little to me." Chapter 20. Recording by Bill Borst.